Diocese of Buffalo has embraced secrecy, and that secrecy has bred shame.
It's really a torturous type of thing.
The time for thinking about doing the right thing is done. It's now time to actually do the right thing. The diocese has this knowledge. They could and should protect children now and in the future, and they should do so.
You've been here for a few years now.
5.5. Yeah.
Why have you never released these names to the public?
There are many reasons for that. That's the policy I inherited.
The head of the Buffalo Catholic Diocese releasing the names of local priests this morning, priests who were removed from the ministry because of credible child sex abuse allegations. There are 42 names on the list. This move reverses 5 decades of secrecy.
The Buffalo Diocese has placed this active priest, Father Dennis Ryder, on administrative leave as it looks into allegations of child sex abuse.
Wednesday, the diocese said 3 of its priests were guilty of abuse. 4 others would be newly investigated.
He was thought of as a god. He was thought of as, do no wrong. The tentacles of that pedophile have touched every part of my life, my being.
While the clergy sexual abuse scandal in the Diocese of Buffalo exploded on his watch, Buffalo Bishop Richard Malone has claimed to be different from the bishops before him who covered up the abuse.
That's a situation I have inherited.
Well, of course, this all predates my arrival in the diocese. I don't know all those details.
We have been going about this whole thing when an allegation comes in an entirely different way than it was done in decades past.
But hundreds of internal church documents obtained by 7 Eyewitness News show that in the case of one priest, Bishop Malone not only returned that priest to ministry after a previous bishop removed him, but ignored 3 new allegations against that priest, misled others about that priest's history, and repeatedly put him around young people, despite clear warnings from parents. The 7 Eyewitness News I-Team has produced dozens of stories on the more than 80 priests and nuns who have been accused of sexual misconduct in the last 6 months. The stories have given voice to victims, but they've also exposed a pattern of how the Catholic Church in Buffalo treats allegations of sexual abuse. In 2011, Father Art Smith caused a controversy at St. Mary of the Lake School in Hamburg when he sent a Facebook message using the words "love you" to an 8th grade boy. The boy's mother, along with St. Mary's principal Christine Hyder, took their concerns to the diocese, saying in an internal memo that Smith was known by students as the Creeper and showed signs of grooming and stalking the young boy. Hyder, the principal, wanted him gone from the school and met with Auxiliary Bishop Edward Grosch, who today plays a key role in the church's response to the abuse crisis. Hyder said Grosch got up from his seat and said of Father Smith, quote, "I thought he was better." Edward Kimmick, who was Bishop of Buffalo during that time, suspended Smith from the parish, announcing that Smith was taking a medical leave. Hyder declined to be interviewed for this story. But according to the principal, Father Smith refused to stay away from the school, showing up outside a classroom in March 2012. The principal fired off a letter to the diocese saying, "This man is a predator and a groomer of young children. Something needs to be done. As school principal, I feel the students in grade 8 have been injured and troubled by the actions of this man more than originally thought. But if Smith's career looked to be in jeopardy then, it would soon get a resurrection, with the arrival of a new bishop in Buffalo in August 2012.
Tonight, Buffalo officially has a new Catholic bishop. Bishop Malone is now the 14th Catholic bishop of Buffalo.
Father Art Smith began making inroads with new Bishop Richard Malone immediately, writing him a letter from a church-run treatment center for priests in Philadelphia, where the Buffalo Diocese sent him for rehabilitation after the incident with the 8th grade boy. "I would like to attend your installation as my new bishop," Smith wrote, requesting a meeting with Malone to talk about, quote, "the progress I have made and the skills I am learning." Later, in a diocesan communication obtained by the I-Team, Smith described the Facebook contact with the student as, quote, "inappropriate," but said he honestly believed it to be innocent and friendly. Diocesan attorney Terry Connors wrote that, quote, "Father Art is minimizing the Facebook incident." But in November 2012, Bishop Malone returned Smith to ministry and what he would describe as a, quote, "lower profile position as chaplain of Brothers of Mercy Nursing Home in Clarence. Smith wrote to Bishop Malone a month later saying, "Thank you kindly for redeeming me and giving some life back to me." In 2013, Smith heard confessions at the diocese's annual Catholic Youth Conference at the Adams Mark Hotel, which left Hyder, the principal at St. Mary's, incredulous. In 2 letters to Bishop Malone, she wrote, If a teacher would have been grooming children and had inappropriate relations with a minor, they would have been fired and lost their license to teach. Yet a priest that has a history of inappropriate contact with the youth was among the youth ministering the sacrament of reconciliation. Malone wrote back to her and stressed that he assigned Smith to Brothers of Mercy because it was a, quote, lower profile position in the diocese, and because the incident with the 8th grader was not technically a violation of the American bishop's zero tolerance policy adopted in 2002. But if Bishop Malone thought that Father Art Smith could do no harm to young people at a nursing home for the elderly, he would be proven wrong yet again. In October 2013, the regional superior of the Brothers of Mercy wrote to Bishop Malone to report that Smith had somehow found 2 young men at the nursing home and had inappropriately touched them both. One man, aged 19, worked in the dietary department and reported inappropriate remarks and touching. The other, a 25-year-old seminarian, reported inappropriate touching in the sacristy after Mass. We were willing to take a chance with Father Art, the superior of the Brothers of Mercy wrote to Bishop Malone, but due to his inappropriate conduct with employees, we must terminate Father Smith's work on our campus. At that point, the bishop pushed Smith to go back to the treatment center in Philadelphia, but records show he initially refused. "Just get rid of me," Smith wrote to the bishop in an email obtained by the I-Team. "Destroy me. I will not subject myself to that torture again." Privately, the bishop wrote to his advisors, "This response shows the depth and gravity of Art's issues. If we cannot convince Art to go to St. John Vianney, the treatment center, he will be placed on the list of unassignable priests." Meanwhile, Father Smith in August 2014 wrote a letter to Pope Francis, where he casted himself as a victim and again said he served for 42 years without incident. "My canon lawyer says that there is absolutely no foundation for the way the Church has treated me," he wrote to the Holy Father. Later, in an email to one of Malone's aides, he mentioned that he has retained both civil and canon lawyers, and wrote, "They know I was done a severe injustice." Documents show Bishop Malone asked Smith to honor their gentleman's agreement that he not wear clerical garb, offer sacraments, or say Mass publicly. When the sexual abuse crisis exploded in Buffalo earlier this year, Malone said the protocol on abusive priests was clear.
And sometimes in the past, and we know this is a mistake now, the verdict would be they can return to ministry. We would never do that now.
What he didn't say then is that in May 2015, despite documented allegations of Smith's behavior, documents show he met with the embattled priest to discuss the possibility of beginning to reintegrate your priestly ministry in the Diocese of Buffalo. Despite the priest's history, Malone granted Smith permission to administer the Eucharist and to hear confessions. In another letter, he offered him, "My gratitude for your service to our diocese," as you assist various priests in local parishes. Meanwhile, Smith's letter to Rome had worked its way through the Vatican, which wanted an explanation from Bishop Malone. In a 2015 letter to the Vatican's investigative agency, Bishop Malone was on the defensive, saying he had good reason to hold Smith from ministry because of Smith's grooming of the young boy and the fact that he checked himself out of the treatment center after only a day. "Under my watch as diocesan bishop," Malone wrote, contrary to what Father Smith stated in his letter, he once again faced boundary issues. He mentioned the 8th grader from Hamburg and the 2 men Smith reportedly touched at Brothers of Mercy. Then the bishop revealed 2 more encounters by Smith that were never made public. A 2004 incident at a city parish where Father Art seemed to groom a seminarian to get his affection. And a 2013 incident at Millard Fillmore Suburban Hospital, in which a 30-year-old male patient complained that Smith was caressing his forearm. Of the 2004 incident, the bishop wrote, "One night the seminarian recounted an incident where Father Art came to his room, came into his bed, and began to touch his genitalia. Then, after telling the Vatican why Father Smith appeared to be so dangerous, Bishop Malone inexplicably ended the letter by saying, 'On the basis of his cooperation in regard to regular counseling, I have granted Father Smith faculties to function as a priest in the Diocese of Buffalo.'" Despite what he said to the Vatican about Smith's long history, just 2 months earlier, Bishop Malone wrote Smith a glowing letter of recommendation to the Apostleship of the Sea cruise service, endorsing Smith to be a chaplain aboard a cruise. The bishop made no mention of Smith's history in writing, quote, "He is a person of good moral character and reputation. I know nothing which would in any way limit or disqualify him from this ministry. I am unaware of anything in his background which would render him unsuitable to work with minor children." Bishop Malone then wrote the same letter of recommendation the following year. Last year, after 5 years of tumult that included 3 new allegations of sexual misconduct, Bishop Malone granted Father Art Smith his wish of returning to a parish. Diocesan records show the bishop assigned Smith to Blessed Mother Teresa Parish in Depew, where he lives to this day, even after being suspended last month when yet another allegation of sexual misconduct was reported to the diocese and substantiated. We've learned that officials on a cruise ship this summer arranged for Father Smith to be removed from that ship when they read our news stories about Smith's recent suspension. But back home in the Diocese of Buffalo, Smith's bedroom is located next door to an old Catholic elementary school, which now houses a preschool. It's directly across the street from the Depew Lancaster Boys and Girls Club.
I have a deep respect for the virtues of piety and obedience.
Kyle is a devout, faithful Catholic from Buffalo, which is why it almost pains him to tell the story of Father Robert Yetter, the longtime pastor of St. Mary's in Swarmville, who 5 years ago offered Kyle what was supposed to be a helping hand.
This was my first opportunity to be able to really ask him some deep questions about the faith so that I could get some answers for what I was searching for.
It was 2013, and Kyle was 25 when Father Yetter took him to see a movie at the Walden Galleria.
We were like lightly laughing about something that was, mildly funny, and then he just kind of finished the laughter with ha ha ha, and then just slaps his hand right here. My first reaction was to freeze. Now I'm this 25-year-old straight guy and never really been in this situation, and I knew if my own dad did that, I wouldn't be okay with it.
Kyle says Yetter kept his hand on his inner thigh for 30 to 45 seconds.
I went from, freeze to fight, and I snapped. I said, "Would you stop touching me?" And he freaked out. He was like, "Whoa, oh, I'm sorry." I was just disgusted and confused about why this was my first interaction with a priest outside of a parish, ever.
Instead of turning away from his faith, Kyle turned to it, becoming a leader in young adult ministry. After becoming a member of a faith community, Kyle in April of last year finally found the strength to come forward.
You have to report this. You have a duty as long as you have the fortitude to do so, because you might not be the only one.
Kyle wasn't the only person to come forward to report sexual advances by Father Yetter to the Diocese of Buffalo. 2 other young men also told the diocese that they witnessed similar experiences with the priest. But hundreds of internal church records obtained by 7 Eyewitness News show that Bishop Malone and those who work for him allowed Yetter to remain a pastor at a large parish with little consequences for his actions. They also took steps to withhold this information from the public. Victim number 2 was the second young man to allege misconduct by Father Yetter. He's too embarrassed to give his name, and we're withholding that name and also Kyle's last name to protect their privacy. He said he was 19 when Yetter offered to help him through a challenging time. They had dinner and wine at the St. Mary's Rectory before Yetter, according to the official complaint submitted to the diocese, reached over, hugged him, and started kissing him on the neck, chin, and cheek. Church records show the victim reported the priest tried to kiss him again while using his hand to grab his pants zipper and genital area. Another time, Yetter allegedly took him to a casino, offered him alcohol, and started kissing his neck, then pushed him onto a chair before he was able to get away. The victim said 2 of his other friends had similar experiences with the priest. The diocese does not appear to have tracked them down. In both cases, the diocese called Yetter in for a meeting with Auxiliary Bishop Edward Grosch, Bishop Malone's point man for the abuse crisis.
So Bishop Grosch, my auxiliary bishop, meets regularly with priests who are unassignable for various reasons.
According to internal memos, Yetter admitted to the touching in the movie theater, but said he didn't remember the incident in the casino. Grosch's solution was to give Yetter a lecture on sexual harassment using this chart. Memos show he referred Yetter for counseling and in both cases reviewed the file with Lawler Quinlan, who along with Terry Connors does legal work for the church. Soon after the allegations, records show the cases were considered closed. As for punishment, Yetter in September 2017 wrote to Grosch to say he planned to travel to Haiti on a mission trip as part of my penance. And in case the diocese had any thoughts about removing him, Yetter ended the letter with a veiled threat. Any pastoral changes at St. Mary's would be sensitive, I think, as parish is number 2 in the diocese for contributions to Upon This Rock, the diocesan capital campaign, 2nd or 3rd in assessments, or the annual tax parishes pay to the diocese, and 7th in fundraising for Catholic charities. By the first day of 2018, Father Yetter was planning the terms of his own retirement, including a trip to Venice, Italy. He told Bishop Malone he planned to serve as pastor until November of this year. The bishop heaped praise on the twice accused priest. Allow me to take this opportunity to express my sentiments of gratitude and appreciation for your years of faithful and effective ministry, Malone wrote. Since you are a priest forever, I am certain that God's people will continue to enjoy your pastoral care as you minister to them when and where you are able in your retirement years. But the very next month, another complaint was sent to the diocese, written by a third victim, this one anonymous. It does not appear the diocese was able to identify the victim, but 1 month later, the abuse crisis in the Diocese of Buffalo exploded. Sources tell 7 Eyewitness News that diocesan leaders considered Father Yetter for inclusion on the diocese list of credibly accused priests, but the diocese removed him before releasing the final version in March, which did not sit well with Kyle.
Knowing that Yetter was not on the list and seeing my own diocese that I have put in countless hours of service for in many different capacities, to be telling everybody that this stuff, the priest, the abuse, is a thing of the past, that everybody on this list is no longer in active ministry or deceased, that this is a problem of yesterday. How do you even do that when they know and they have documentation that people like me had gone through what I had gone through?
One possibility is that the church treats cases like Kyle's and that of victim number 2 differently because both men were over the age of 18 and therefore did not technically fall under this charter written by American bishops in 2002 to deal with sexual abuse.
Even though it was by another man who made a vow to God, who is 50 years older than me, that doesn't have to be reported, apparently. If I did that in my job, I'd lose my job. I'd potentially be facing jail time on the first incident, period.
In Buffalo, these cases are handled by the Diocesan Review Board, a group of mostly lay Catholics who are appointed by the diocese. Church Attorney Quinlan, in an email, gave Bishop Malone some insight into why that board didn't give Yetter much of a punishment. He wrote, quote, "There was some concern that Father Yetter should not be treated more harshly than other priests who have been accused by adults of offensive or sexual contact." Memos show Bishop Malone went to see Father Yetter himself on June 3rd, celebrating Mass with the priest and mentioning the victim's concerns. He totally downplays any evil intent, the bishop wrote in an internal memo. He says his hand was on Kyle's thigh only momentarily. If that response bothered the bishop, he didn't give any indication in a follow-up letter 6 days later, when Malone wrote to the priest to thank him for his, quote, generous gift. The bishop told Yetter it was a joy to be with you, and wrote, "Be assured of my ongoing prayers and best wishes for you and your priestly ministry." That may explain why our email to the diocese on July 5th asking whether there were any allegations against Father Yetter sent the bishop and his staff scrambling. "This does not strike me as transparent," I wrote to the diocesan spokesman. "A cover-up of adult sexual misconduct is still a cover-up. In the interest of transparency, can you please clear this up?" Publicly, the diocese gave no response. But privately, Bishop Malone replied, "We have no obligation to report to Specht or anyone else on adult misconduct allegations." He then wrote to Bishop Gross, "Please call Bob to alert him to this inquiry. Specht may well call Bob about this, so he should be prepared. And remind him that we still want him to go for an assessment." The assessment refers to an evaluation the bishop ordered Father Yetter to undergo 10 months earlier. Sources say no one ever followed up on that directive until we sent our email. After the email, Bishop Gross wrote that it is imperative to get Father Yetter to Southdown as soon as possible, referring to the church-run treatment center in Canada, where the Buffalo Diocese for years has sent its accused priests for rehabilitation. In light of our questions, documents show Father Yetter moved up his retirement date to September 1st. And Kyle will once again be able to attend Mass at St. Mary's. He said he wasn't able to have his wedding at his childhood parish. Kyle met with Bishop Malone in June of this year and says the bishop told him that he was Father Yetter's only victim. But documents show at the time of that meeting, the diocese already had the complaints of victim number 2, as well as a third anonymous victim on file. They also show Bishop Malone was made aware of these complaints by a diocesan lawyer who gave him an update before that meeting.
In that spirit, I asked Bishop Malone, "So you're saying that I was the only one?" And he said, "Yes, I've reviewed his case. You're the only one that's come forward." So knowing what I know now, and that that's not true, I can't see that any other way than that he lied to me. And it's not good for a bishop to break the 8th commandment.
Well, leaders from across Western New York are calling on the Catholic Bishop of Buffalo, Richard Malone, to resign his post today after our two-part I-Team investigation into the continued cover-up of sexual abuse in the Diocese of Buffalo. These leaders say the bishop has no credibility and must step aside for the church to move forward and public trust to be restored.
Bishop Malone knowingly and repeatedly put people in the Catholic Church, and in particular children, in harm's way when he decided to protect a group of predators instead of trying to help a group of victims. By reintroducing these priests into parish communities where they were viewed as men to be trusted and people you could form close relationships with, he's complicit in the carnage that they've brought about, and he should have resigned his post.
They've not handled it well, and I think it's clear when you see the documentation that directly contradicts the assertions that this bishop made about not reassigning priests into ministries in close proximity to kids.
Why would there not be an opening up of our doors of the church to let all of the independent investigations come in so that these victims can be treated fairly, this church can be cured of this plague, and we can be allowed to heal as a community? No one was told. We could have done nothing about this until we read your reporting.
New developments tonight connected to the ongoing church abuse scandal.
New York's Attorney General now issuing subpoenas to every Catholic diocese in the state. It's all part of the ongoing investigation and how the 8 dioceses handled and possibly covered up allegations of sexual abuse involving children. Today's move comes only 2 weeks after our explosive I-Team investigation uncovering the Buffalo bishop's handling of sex abuse allegations.
Tonight, the 7 Eyewitness News I-Team reveals a list of priests accused of sexual misconduct that was concealed by the Buffalo Diocese, never meant to see the light of day. Good evening. The list, quite different from the one released to the public by the diocese back in March. That list contained 42 names. The secret list has more than 100. In his exclusive report, 7 Eyewitness News I-Team Chief Investigator Charlie Specht details tonight the lengths the diocese went to in order to hide this list from your eyes.
When the Diocese of Buffalo in March revealed the list of 42 priests who were removed from ministry, were retired, or left ministry after allegations of sexual abuse of a minor, Bishop Richard Malone billed it as a historic coming clean of decades worth of secrets.
Victims often find themselves kind of liberated and empowered to come forth. If they've not yet come forth, if they see in print the name of their abuser.
But new evidence obtained by 7 Eyewitness News from inside the diocese's secret archives shows the true scope of abuse was much larger than Malone publicly let on, with a total of not 42, but 106 accused priests on the church's original draft list. But a second internal document indicates that may be understating the problem. A database of diocesan employees who have been accused of criminal, abusive, or inappropriate behavior, or who have been the victims of such behavior, reveals 324 names, mostly priests, but also deacons, nuns, and lay employees. Records show church officials made exceptions that allowed them to remove the majority of accused priests from the final list. That resulted in a much lower number for the public to digest, and it also allowed Bishop Malone to say that no accused priest was still in active ministry, even though in multiple cases that was not true. In addition to the 42 accused priests Malone identified in March, records show church leadership had full knowledge of another 64 accused priests, whose names were removed before the list was made public. 25 of them were religious order priests like Franciscans and Jesuits. 19 were diocesan priests who were dead but accused by, as the diocese put it, only one victim. And 20 more were accused but kept off the list because they did not fit the diocese's carefully crafted criteria for disclosure.
The Catholic Diocese is not being transparent. They are hiding. They are deflecting. They are coming up with their own excuses, internal excuses by these categories. There's no categories. There's allegations. And if there are allegations, there should be investigations being conducted.
Barry Covert is an attorney representing a victim of Father Fabian Mariansky. Stephanie McIntyre was a 15-year-old at St. Patrick's Church in Barker when she says Mariansky began 7 years of abuse that not only robbed me of my youthful innocence, but destroyed my family. McIntyre hired a lawyer and reported the abuse to the diocese in 1995. The diocese suspended Mariansky but returned him to ministry in 2000, and he was assigned to a church in Clarence until recently. When creating the list of 42 accused priests, diocesan officials wrote, "We did not remove him from ministry despite full knowledge of the case, and so including him on the list might require explanation."
That is as cowardly of a document and an entry as I could ever imagine. We have an adult that was a child when she was abused. The appropriate thing to do would be to not only remove him, but try to investigate and see whether on top of my client, there are other victims out there that he has abused.
Instead, Bishop Malone let Mariansky continue in ministry at Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary Church in Clarence until May 6, when McIntyre told her story to the Buffalo News. Reporter Jay Tokaz said Malone told him he was not aware the allegation against Mariansky involved a minor. But diocesan records obtained by the I-Team show church lawyers informed Malone about the Mariansky case when he first became bishop in 2012. That entry was part of a confidential 300-page black binder of diocesan secrets that includes stories of sex abuse, theft, and other pending matters inherited by the bishop when he took office. Mariansky initially denied the allegations to the news, but then admitted he had sexual relations with McIntyre, but after she was an adult. This week, he again denied the allegations to 7 Eyewitness News. But the document prepared for the bishop by diocesan lawyers specifies that she said she was 15 when the abuse started. Father Mariansky's faculties were temporarily suspended, and he was on leave from the diocese, the document states. He has since been returned to ministry.
What the heck was he doing at my parish? Why did the bishop let him come to my parish and serve, and nonetheless a parish with a Catholic school? It makes no sense to me.
Bill Ogilvie is a father of 3 whose daughter was an altar server with Mariansky at Nativity. He was shocked and angered to learn that Bishop Malone allowed the priest to stay in ministry without notifying the parish.
I never would have allowed my daughter to serve on the altar with a priest who had these sort of allegations in his past. It's so far beyond ridiculous. It's so hard to believe that these things are actually happening.
In May, Ogilvie wrote a letter to Bishop Malone seeking an explanation. He says he never got a response and sees this as a sign that Malone has not been transparent.
He had the opportunity to do that when he released those original 40 names that obviously should have been quite a few more names. But because he didn't do that, because he still shrouds the diocese in secrecy, he has done no favors to any of the constituents within his diocese.
But Mariansky isn't the only priest the diocese kept off its list for what Ogilvie sees as questionable reasons. Diocesan officials kept another current priest off the list because he, quote, credibly denied the claims made by a woman that the priest made her sons parade around in their underwear. But then they gave a more urgent reason for not disclosing the allegation to the public. He is still functioning as a pastor and so should not be on the list. Another priest, Father Joseph Rappel, who was accused of showing pornography to a 14-year-old and who has since been accused of sexual abuse, was kept off the list because, as diocesan officials put it, he does not fit our categories, and so we would have to change them to include him.
And the church now is claiming that they're not going to include this priest who showed pornography to a 14-year-old because they would have to change their own internal categories. Who cares about their categories?
7 Eyewitness News has obtained documents that refer to a database created by Sister Regina Murphy, who was then the diocese archivist and who now serves as chancellor. The documents summarized confidential files and allegations as of May 1, 2017. A database has been created that lists all persons who have been accused of criminal, abusive, or inappropriate behavior, or who have been the victim of such behavior, the document states. The list includes 324 total names, 202 diocesan priests, including former priests, 44 religious order priests, 61 laypersons or non-ordained employees of the church, like Catholic school teachers, 7 deacons, and 7 women religious. A church official confirmed the context of the database, but said these offenses are not exclusively sexual and also appear to include violations against both minors and adults, which explains this higher set of figures. Memos between Sister Regina and Bishop Malone indicate she created the database last year in locations at diocesan headquarters that were nicknamed The Well and The Secret Archives. The memos state that no government agency is to have full access to the secret documents without a court order or subpoena. Sister Regina tells Malone in a 2017 memo that in the cases of 7 particular priest files, we are awaiting our lawyer's confirmation that these materials can be shredded. After victims called the diocese, wondering why the names of various priests were not on the list, those same lawyers urged Malone not to alter the original list of 42. Church attorney Lawler Quinlan wrote in a March 20th email, "This is probably the first of many complaints about the list, not including every priest against whom we have ever received a complaint. We need to weather this storm for a while without changing our list." Bishop Malone said he agreed, and in another email hinted that the list was perhaps not as complete as the diocese wanted the public to believe. Tom Beecher, a Buffalo lawyer who is one of the bishop's key supporters, wrote a letter to the editor to the Buffalo News on March 12th, saying the great majority of priests have never harmed a soul. He said a victim advocate's claim that the real number of abusive priests was double or triple the 19 who were accused at that time was, quote, unsubstantiated and speculation. Great letter to the editor, Auxiliary Bishop Edward Grosch wrote in an email. Bishop Malone responded, saying, except that we know there are more names than Tom and others would like to think.
The bishop had a chance to right the ship and to pick up whatever credibility he had left. I think we were all willing to let him do that. But now with the revelations over the past couple of weeks, he claims he wants to be a good shepherd and that a good shepherd never leaves his flock. But if he really cared about the diocese and wanted to see the diocese rise from its ashes, which is where it is right now, he would shepherd the transition to a new leadership.
Now, in response, the spokeswoman for the Diocese of Buffalo released a statement saying that it, quote, conducted an extensive, deliberate, and careful process of releasing the names of diocesan priests about whom we have received substantiated allegations of abuse, a standard of transparency to which we will continue to hold ourselves moving forward.
Historic move by federal prosecutors.
7 Eyewitness News I-Team Chief Investigator Charlie Specht uncovering these emails. They confirm the feds have hit the Diocese of Buffalo with a subpoena as they investigate sexual abuse by Western New York priests. Good evening, everyone. A source confirming to the I-Team that the subpoena served to the Diocese of Buffalo was related to pornography, taking victims across state lines, and the use of cell phones and social media.
This marks the first time the feds have ever investigated the Catholic Church, with most investigations previously being handled by state and local authorities. At least 7 Pennsylvania dioceses have also been subpoenaed.
I am a very ordinary person, and I found myself in rather extraordinary circumstances. And the way I look at it is that I was the right person in the right place at the right time, and God gave me the strength to do the right thing.
Without Siobhan O'Connor, the Diocese of Buffalo may have pulled off one of the greatest cover-ups in the history of the Catholic Church. O'Connor served for 3 years as Bishop Richard Malone's personal secretary. She's deeply religious and once studied to become a nun. But while working at Malone's side, she began to see the ugly underbelly of how the Diocese of Buffalo handled sexual abuse. She went public earlier today as a key whistleblower and source in 7 Eyewitness News' 3-part I-Team investigation into Malone's handling of sexual abuse, telling the national news magazine 60 Minutes that she felt morally compelled to provide key documents describing a cover-up of allegations under Malone's watch. Before the airing of the 60 Minutes piece, O'Connor explained to 7 Eyewitness News that the seeds for her actions were planted in March, when the diocese announced a settlement program for victims of sexual abuse. The diocese was so unprepared for the wave of allegations that she began taking phone calls from victims, many who had waited years for justice from the church.
And then I began to be attached to these people. I mean, they shared their lives with me, and I cried with them, and I cared about them.
Publicly, Bishop Malone said he wanted victims to come forward, but a hotline created by the diocese rang to an empty office in Cheektowaga, manned remotely by a part-time employee. All calls for the first 3 weeks went directly to voicemail. After waiting weeks for a return call, O'Connor says victims began showing up at the chancery to tell their stories. O'Connor listened to one man's story in a supply closet because the diocese had set aside no space to hear these victims.
And he told me that his wife had died a few years ago and he hadn't even told her, and then he shared what he had endured, and I was just, I was really overcome in that moment, because you just can see how raw that pain is, and I wished I could do more for him.
O'Connor was moved to write a newspaper opinion piece in June, where she said victims deserved compassion, not criticism.
I remember finding out after the fact that Bishop Malone was not pleased with the article I wrote, because he said that it was not supportive enough of him, it was overly supportive of the victims. And I was told by another member of senior staff that I had an inordinate sympathy for the victims. And I don't think that's possible.
But it was Malone's handling of 2 accused priests that finally convinced her it was time to quit her job. She wrote in emails to the bishop that she was becoming morally allergic to that job.
I already knew at that point that things were not self-correcting. It wasn't as though the diocese had just kind of careened off the path and were righting themselves. Things were not going in the right direction, and I thought you were the one who might be able to help the most from the outside.
That's when I approached O'Connor, and we had the first of many secret meetings in this abandoned parking lot. She began to reveal a trove of secret documents that implicated Bishop Malone in the mishandling of clergy sexual abuse allegations.
And I remember thinking that I would trust you with this information, that you would not treat it in a salacious manner. I could tell you had great compassion for the victims, and that you also had respect for our church.
Exposing the bishop's actions was not a decision O'Connor came to easily.
I devoted my life to working for him. I knew him very well. He had invited me into his home. I had traveled with him. And yet I realized that sometimes you have to have a loyalty to something greater, and an allegiance to the common good versus someone's personal good. And especially when I thought about the survivors, I thought I would be betraying them if I didn't do something.
The explosive information has led to calls for Bishop Malone to resign. On the advice of church lawyers, he called an emergency news conference 3 days after our first bombshell I-Team investigation and admitted wrongdoing but refused to resign.
The shepherd does not desert the flock at a difficult time.
By the end of it, I was in tears because it was just business as usual. A task force, a new office, a new staff member, strengthening the code of conduct. There's nothing wrong with the code of conduct. It needs to be enforced. And there were so many things he could have done, and he didn't. Instead, they locked down those files, and it went just to that protect the diocese, protect the bishop.
Sources say those aggressive moves are one reason the FBI has now launched a criminal investigation into the diocese. O'Connor feels the scrutiny is a long time coming, but knows it will take a toll on her former colleagues.
I think that I'm going to lose a lot of friends because of this, because I brought pain upon them. You know, I brought dark days to the Catholic Center.
O'Connor was ready to pay the price for speaking truth to the most powerful institution on earth, but says she now feels at peace for standing up for what was right.
I remember thinking, even if they put me in jail, at least in jail I would have a clear conscience. But I would have been imprisoned by regret for my whole life if I didn't do this. So in a certain sense, as much as I did it for the survivors and for our diocese and our community, I did it for myself too, because I couldn't have walked away and lived with myself. So I was really compelled to do this in many respects, but for my own soul.
At a news conference 2 weeks ago, Bishop Richard Malone said he had a good record on dealing with sexually abusive priests.
You'd call it a cover-up, we call it confidentially.
He pointed to his time in the Diocese of Portland, Maine, where he served for 8 years before coming to Buffalo. But here in the bishop's old Diocese of Portland, Maine, advocates for victims of sexual abuse, as well as new documents obtained by the I-Team, paint a much different picture of the bishop's past, especially when it comes to the issue of sexual abuse. The I-Team traveled to Maine and talked to Catholics like Paul Kendrick, who's an advocate for victims of sexual abuse.
The Bishop Malone I came to know here in Maine is an actor on a stage.
Kendrick sparred with Malone many times, calling for him to be more transparent. His battles with Malone drew national attention when the bishop threatened to deny Kendrick Holy Communion.
Malone is a fake, a phony. The Irish say a phony baloney. He's not telling the truth when he likes to say, I never knew.
But even Kendrick didn't know what we were able to find in these confidential documents that describe how Malone handled abuse controversies involving these two priests in Maine. The documents are summaries of two separate investigations conducted by this man, John Brennan, a Catholic deacon and a 30-year law enforcement veteran who retired as the deputy chief of the Portland Police Department. Brennan served as the Portland Diocese internal investigator during Malone's 8-year tenure. He declined an interview request because he is cooperating with the FBI, but Brennan confirmed to the I-Team the authenticity of the documents. With respect to the Vatican and Bishop Malone, he wrote in one report, this was a complete cover-up of the highest order that cannot possibly be explained or defended, and still screams out for justice. It was here at this parish in South Portland where a priest was suspended for befriending a violent sex offender and allowing him to live in the parish rectory. The priest was Father Paul Coughlin. The sex offender, a man named John Skinner. Skinner was convicted in 2004 of sexually abusing two boys he met through Catholic youth groups. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison, and the reports describe what Brennan calls two outrageous situations regarding the pedophile and the priest. The first involved a 15-year-old boy whom Skinner allegedly raped. The report says Skinner brought the boy to Father Coughlin, who failed to call the police. Later, according to the report, Father Coughlin tried to get Skinner hired as a youth minister at his parish and allowed him to live in the parish rectory, just steps away from this parish center frequented by kids.
Are you kidding me? You have a man who served time, been convicted of child sexual abuse, rape? You have him living in your rectory?
After his investigation, Brennan wrote the Vatican issued a mild rebuke of Father Coughlin and allowed Malone to remove him from ministry. But after 2 years, Brennan wrote that Bishop Malone took it upon himself to secretly return this priest to ministry. Newspaper archives confirm Brennan's account, quoting Bishop Malone as saying, I believe Father Coughlin has had adequate time to reflect on his actions. Malone took the unusual step of barring Coughlin from ministry in these 3 cities while allowing him to serve as a priest in the rest of the state. Brennan says Malone reversed that decision only after employees at the Portland Chancery expressed their outrage.
I mean, what kind of insanity is that? The so-called crisis in the church has been going on about protecting children, and this guy Coughlin brings in a convicted pedophile to roam around. And that Coughlin would think that's okay, and then Malone would go to bat for Coughlin?
The second case involves Father Thomas Lee. According to Brennan's interviews with more than 10 adults, Father Lee would take them camping when they were children and allow them to swim nude as he shined a light on them. He suggested they should take turns showering, entered the shower area and took photographs of them, invited the children into his bedroom, and while they were still naked, covered their bodies with powder. He would then massage their entire bodies, including their genital areas, often using an electrical device as he massaged them. Brennan wrote a 60-page report, but the allegations went nowhere even after the Diocesan Review Board unanimously affirmed the complaint against Father Lee had been substantiated. After a first internal church trial found Father Lee innocent, Brennan put pressure on the bishop, telling him the Father Lee case would come back to haunt him, and that if the Father Lee case resulted in a civil trial or some kind of criminal investigation, I would not lie or cover up the facts to protect the diocese. Malone took Brennan's advice and petitioned the Vatican for a second trial. But Lee was again found innocent after the 3 judges, all priests, found Father Lee's actions to be imprudent, but none of them were sinful in any respect. Brennan says he was not allowed to submit his report or contact witnesses to testify at either trial. The bishop told reporters he was stunned and disappointed at the outcome of the case. But Brennan wrote, when I complained to Bishop Malone that this was yet another extraordinary cover-up by the Vatican of child sexual abuse by a member of the Catholic priesthood, he indicated that there was nothing more that he could do.
And he had so little respect for the harms and injuries of the children by this priest that he just threw his hands up. Said, too bad. Here's the process. Here's what the church tells me to do.
Father Lee is retired but still listed as a priest in the Portland Priest Directory. Just this summer, parish bulletins show he was honored at a Mass at Good Shepherd Parish. Brennan says he, quote, personally witnessed Father Lee proudly standing at the altar of the Diocese Cathedral during major celebrations, and I have even encountered him at a private reception at Bishop Malone's home. Between New York and Maine, Bishop Malone has now been criticized for the way he has handled 5 separate cases of misconduct involving minors. Many have wondered why a bishop would take the chance supporting priests accused of abuse. But Kendrick has a theory.
I see Malone as a career climber, as a guy, you know, he thought he'd go from here to, I think, Boston or Philadelphia or Chicago, perhaps, one of the larger dioceses. That's what he's interested in. Because guess what? If he yells too loud, he's not going to go to Philadelphia or Buffalo even. He knows that.
Charlie Specht, 7 Eyewitness News.
Now, in response to our reporting, Bishop Malone issued a statement that reads in part, quote, I stand by the fact that the canonical process as it relates to Father Thomas Lee and Father Paul Coughlin was scrupulously followed during my time as bishop in Portland, Maine. For anyone to imply that there was any sort of cover-up in either case is patently false. We were transparent, issuing press releases and letters to the faithful throughout both investigations.
We are following breaking news out of Albany tonight, where the state legislature has now passed the Child Victims Act. This bill now awaits Governor Cuomo's signature. Now, this act will give victims of child sex abuse decades longer to file lawsuits or seek criminal charges against their abusers. It comes on the heels of the sex abuse scandal exposed by the 7 Eyewitness News I-Team that has rocked the Buffalo Catholic Diocese. Our I-Team Chief Investigator Charlie Specht is live in Albany tonight.
Keith, it's really a historic day here at the state capitol in Albany after state legislators, after years of delay and debate, have finally decided to reform what many have called its archaic sexual abuse laws. Senators today gave passionate testimony about sexual abuse of children, perhaps none more so than State Senator Tim Kennedy, a Catholic Democrat from South Buffalo, who said, his religion aside, this is a matter of human rights and justice. Kennedy specifically cited the abuse scandal that has enveloped the Diocese of Buffalo, led to a federal investigation, and cited our reporting when it comes to the handling of sexual abuse by the current Bishop Richard Malone and his predecessors. Now, what this legislation will do is change the statutes of limitation from the age of 23 to 28 in criminal cases and 55 in civil cases. It will also establish a 1-year window period where victims of childhood sexual abuse can take action in court and file lawsuits against the institutions or their abusers, no matter when the original abuse took place. Nobody was happier and more relieved when this legislation passed in the state Senate unanimously than Michael Whalen, the abuse victim from South Buffalo, who first came forward nearly a year ago and brought all of these abuse cases to light.
It means a lot to me and my family and to all the victims that have been hurting, waiting for this moment.
Victims and survivors of childhood sexual abuse in the Diocese of Buffalo specifically, but all throughout the church, all throughout the state and the nation, these victims of abuse that have so courageously told their story. Today is their day. Today is the day where we bring them closure, where we allow them to finally bring to light their abusers and finally get that justice that they've been longing for, fighting for, and that they rightfully deserve.
When the bill was passed unanimously, it was hard for Whalen to mask his emotions. He did it for his kids.
They see that, I fought a good fight.
In the hopes that people like him will no longer suffer in silence.
My grandkids, you know what I'm saying, for my kids, that any harm that comes, they have that power now. You know what I'm saying? God forbid anything happen, but I am so glad.
When a senator simply apologized from the Senate floor,
we apologize for making you wait so.
It meant a lot. It's been a long year for Whalen, but one that has been worth all the effort.
Right. I wouldn't change nothing. I'm so glad that I came forward.
Now, as far as when this bill would be signed into law by Governor Cuomo, the Lieutenant Governor says it's really just a matter of days. The law would bring New York more in line with other states in the nation when it comes to childhood sexual abuse legislation. And Lieutenant Governor Hochul said, most importantly, it will send a message to victims and survivors of sexual abuse everywhere that New York State is finally on their side. From the Capitol, Charlie Specht, 7 Eyewitness News.